Trapped in the Shadows, a collection of horror stories. Story 1. The Haunted House. Lena and her husband Alex were excited about moving into their new duplex. It was a great deal, and the price was unbeatable. They were looking for a new start, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity. They were both thrilled about the new place and the future it held. The duplex was old and had been abandoned for years, but Lena and Alex were not deterred by the age of the building. They were excited about the possibility of restoring the old place and making it their own. However, they were not prepared for what they were about to face. The first night they spent in the duplex was uneventful. They unpacked their belongings and settled into their new home. The next morning, they woke up to find that some of their belongings were missing. They searched the entire duplex but couldn't find them. It was strange, but they thought they had misplaced them during the move. Days turned into weeks, and the couple noticed that strange things were happening in the duplex. They heard footsteps when no one was around, doors opening and closing on their own, and objects moving by themselves. Lena and Alex were both getting scared, but they tried to ignore it, thinking it was their imagination playing tricks on them. One evening, Lena was cooking dinner when she felt a presence in the room. She turned around and saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was a woman dressed in a long white dress. Lena was terrified and screamed for Alex. When he arrived, he saw the figure as well. They both ran out of the duplex, not looking back. After a few days of staying in a hotel, Lena and Alex decided to go back to the duplex and investigate the strange happenings. They did some research and found out that the duplex had a dark past. It was built in the late 1800s by a wealthy family, and it was rumored that the daughter of the family died in the house under mysterious circumstances. The family moved away shortly after her death, and the duplex was left abandoned for years. Lena and Alex decided to perform a cleansing ritual to get rid of the negative energy in the house. They lit candles and burned sage, hoping to cleanse the duplex of any evil spirits. For a few days, it seemed like the ritual had worked. The couple did not experience any more strange occurrences, and they were happy that they could finally live in peace. However, their happiness was short-lived. One night, Lena woke up to find a strange figure standing at the foot of her bed. She couldn't make out the figure, but she knew it was not human. She screamed for Alex, but he did not wake up. The figure disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, and Lena was left terrified. The next day, Lena and Alex decided to seek help from a paranormal investigator. The investigator was skeptical at first, but after seeing the strange occurrences in the duplex, he agreed to help. He performed a series of tests and investigations, and his findings were shocking. The duplex was indeed haunted by the daughter of the family that had lived there in the late 1800s. Her death had not been an accident, but a murder. Her father had killed her in a fit of rage, and her spirit was trapped in the duplex, seeking revenge on anyone who disturbed her rest. The paranormal investigator advised Lena and Alex to leave the duplex immediately, as it was not safe for them to stay. They followed his advice and moved out of the duplex, never looking back. Years went by, and the duplex remained abandoned. It was said that the ghost of the murdered daughter still haunted the place, and that anyone who entered the duplex would never return. The stories of the haunted duplex spread, and it became a popular destination for ghost hunters and thrill seekers. However, one day, a group of teenagers decided to explore the abandoned duplex. They were intrigued by the stories they had heard and wanted to see if they could experience any supernatural phenomena. As they entered the duplex, they immediately felt a cold breeze and heard strange noises. The teenagers explored the duplex, and as they reached the basement, they saw a figure standing in the corner. It was the ghost of the murdered daughter, and she looked angry. The teenagers tried to run, but they found themselves trapped in the basement. The ghost of the murdered daughter had locked the door, and they were unable to escape. As the night wore on, the teenagers realized that they were not alone. They saw the ghost of the murdered daughter and other ghosts that haunted the duplex. They were scared and knew that they were in danger. They tried to find a way out but were unsuccessful. In the early hours of the morning, the teenagers were found by the police. They were traumatized and had to undergo therapy to recover from the experience. The haunted duplex was once again abandoned, and it remained a popular destination for ghost hunters and thrill seekers. But no one ever stayed for long. In conclusion, the haunted duplex was a place of horror and terror. The ghost of the murdered daughter and other ghosts haunted the place, seeking revenge on anyone who entered. The stories of the haunted duplex spread far and wide, and it became a popular destination for ghost hunters and thrill seekers. However, those who entered the duplex never returned, and it remained a place of fear and dread for years to come. Story 2. The Lost Cemetery. It was a bright and sunny day, and John and his friends were out exploring the woods. They had heard rumors of a lost cemetery deep in the forest, and they were determined to find it. They packed their backpacks with water and snacks and set out on their adventure. As they walked through the woods, they saw an old stone wall covered in ivy. It was a strange sight, as the wall was not visible from the main path. They followed the wall and saw an opening that led to a hidden path. They decided to follow it, and it led them to a clearing where they found an old cemetery. The cemetery was overgrown with weeds and bushes. The tombstones were cracked and weathered, and some were missing altogether. John and his friends were fascinated by the sight and began exploring the cemetery. As they walked among the graves, they noticed something strange. The dates on the tombstones were much older than they had expected. The oldest one they found was from the early 1800s. As they continued exploring, they came across a large tombstone with an inscription that read, "Here lies the victims of the witch trials." John and his friends were taken aback by the sight. They had never heard of any witch trials in the area. They decided to investigate further and went back to town to do some research. They spent hours at the local library, looking through old newspapers and archives. They found out that there had indeed been a witch trial in the area in the late 1700s. A group of women had been accused of witchcraft and were burned at the stake. The location of their burial was unknown, but it was rumored that they were buried somewhere in the woods. John and his friends were excited by the discovery and went back to the cemetery to explore further. As they walked among the graves, they heard strange noises coming from the woods. They ignored it and continued their exploration. However, the noises became louder and more intense. Suddenly, they heard a scream coming from the woods. John and his friends ran towards the sound and saw a figure in the distance. It was a woman dressed in black, with long hair and a pale complexion. She was standing in front of a tree, muttering something under her breath. John and his friends were scared but intrigued by the sight. As they approached the woman, she turned towards them, and they saw that her eyes were glowing red. She started walking towards them, and they backed away slowly. Suddenly, she disappeared, and they were left standing in the woods, alone and terrified. The group decided to leave the woods and went back to town. They were shaken by the experience and knew that they had stumbled upon something sinister. They decided to investigate further and went back to the library to do more research. They found out that the woman they had seen in the woods was one of the accused witches from the trial. She had been burned at the stake and was buried in the lost cemetery. Her spirit had never found peace, and she haunted the woods, seeking revenge on those who disturbed her rest. John and his friends were scared but intrigued by the story. They decided to go back to the lost cemetery to see if they could find any evidence of the witch's presence. As they walked among the graves, they felt a chill in the air. Suddenly, they heard a voice whispering their names. They turned around and saw the figure of the witch standing in front of them. She looked angry and had an eerie glow around her. John and his friends tried to run, but they found themselves trapped in the cemetery. The witch had put up a barrier that prevented them from leaving. The witch approached John and his friends, and they could feel the hatred emanating from her. She accused them of disturbing her rest and warned them of the consequences. John and his friends pleaded with her, saying that they didn't mean any harm and that they were sorry. The witch seemed to soften a bit, and she asked them why they had come to the lost cemetery. John explained that they were just curious and that they wanted to learn more about the history of the area. The witch listened intently, and then she spoke. She told them that she had been wrongly accused of witchcraft and that she had been burned at the stake for crimes she didn't commit. She said that she had been buried in the lost cemetery along with the other accused witches, and that they had been forgotten by history. She said that her spirit had been trapped in the woods for centuries, and that she had been waiting for someone to find her and set her free. John and his friends were shocked by the story, and they promised to help the witch. They asked her how they could help, and she told them that they needed to find her bones and give her a proper burial. She said that her bones were buried somewhere in the woods, and that they had to find them before sunrise or she would be trapped forever. John and his friends were determined to help the witch, and they set out to find her bones. They searched the woods, following clues and old maps, and eventually, they found a small cave. Inside the cave, they found a pile of bones, and they knew that they had found the witch's remains. They took the bones back to the lost cemetery and buried them in a proper grave. As they did, they could feel the presence of the witch fading away. When they were done, they said a prayer and thanked the witch for sharing her story with them. As they walked out of the lost cemetery, they felt a sense of peace and closure. They knew that they had helped the witch find peace, and that they had righted a wrong from the past. They also knew that they had experienced something extraordinary and that they would never forget the lost cemetery and the witch who haunted it. From that day on, the lost cemetery was no longer a place of fear and dread. It became a place of reverence and respect, a place where the past could be remembered and honored. John and his friends continued to explore the woods, but they did so with a newfound appreciation for the history and the spirits that inhabited it. They knew that the lost cemetery would always hold a special place in their hearts, and that the witch's story would be told for generations to come. However, as time passed, strange things started to happen to John and his friends. They would hear whispers in the night, see shadows moving in the corner of their eyes, and feel an icy breeze on their necks. They tried to brush it off, thinking that it was just their imagination or the wind, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. One night, John woke up to find his room filled with mist. He tried to get up, but he found that he couldn't move. He could see a figure moving towards him, and as it got closer, he realized that it was the witch. She had returned, and she was not happy. She spoke to him, telling him that he and his friends had disturbed her rest once again. She said that they had no right to meddle in her affairs, and that they had only made things worse. John tried to explain that they had only tried to help her, but the witch didn't want to hear it. She said that they had to pay for what they had done. John was terrified, and he pleaded with the witch to spare him and his friends. He promised that they would never come back to the lost cemetery again, and that they would leave her in peace. The witch seemed to consider his words, and then she spoke. She said that she would spare him and his friends, but only if they made a sacrifice. She said that they had to bring her a young, pure soul, someone who had never sinned or done wrong. She said that this was the only way to appease her, and that if they failed, she would come for them. John was horrified by the witch's demand, and he knew that they could never find someone who had never sinned. He tried to plead with her, but she was adamant. She said that this was the price they had to pay for meddling in her affairs, and that she would not be denied. John and his friends were trapped. They didn't know what to do, and they were afraid for their lives. They knew that they couldn't find someone who had never sinned, and they also knew that they couldn't run from the witch. They were caught between a rock and a hard place, and they didn't know how to get out. As the days passed, John and his friends started to feel the effects of the witch's curse. They would hear strange noises in the night, see shadows moving around them, and feel a sense of dread wherever they went. They knew that the witch was still watching them, and that she was waiting for them to make a mistake. Finally, John came up with a plan. He knew that they couldn't find someone who had never sinned, but he also knew that they could trick the witch. He gathered his friends, and they started to work on a plan. They found a statue of a young girl in a nearby park, and they decided to use it as their sacrifice. They covered the statue with white cloth, and then they brought it to the lost cemetery. They placed it on a pedestal and waited for the witch to arrive. As the witch approached, she could feel the presence of the young girl. She thought that it was the sacrifice that John and his friends had brought her, and she was pleased. She reached out to touch the statue, but as she did, she realized that something was wrong. She lifted the cloth and found that the statue was not a real girl. She screamed in anger, realizing that she had been tricked. She cursed John and his friends, telling them that they would never be free of her wrath. John and his friends ran from the lost cemetery, knowing that the witch would be after them. They didn't know if they were safe or if they had escaped her curse, but as they left the cemetery, they could hear the witch's voice behind them, promising that they would pay for their deceit. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. John and his friends thought that they had escaped the witch's wrath, but they were wrong. They started to experience strange phenomena in their homes. They would hear footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. Their possessions would move on their own, and they would see the ghostly figure of the witch lurking in the shadows. John and his friends knew that they had to do something to break the curse. They decided to seek the help of a local psychic, hoping that she could help them. The psychic listened to their story and agreed to help them. She conducted a seance, calling forth the spirit of the witch. As the spirit appeared, the psychic tried to communicate with her. She asked the witch why she was still haunting John and his friends. The witch responded, saying that they had broken their promise, and that they had to pay for their deceit. The psychic then asked the witch what they could do to break the curse. The witch said that the only way to break the curse was for them to find the real young girl that the statue was based on, and to bring her to the lost cemetery as a sacrifice. John and his friends were stunned. They didn't know how to find the young girl that the statue was based on. The psychic suggested that they search through old records and newspapers to try and find any information about the girl. They spent weeks searching through old archives, trying to find any information about the girl. Finally, they came across a newspaper article about a young girl who had died in a tragic accident. The article described her as pure and innocent, with no sins to her name. John and his friends knew that they had found their sacrifice. They tracked down the girl's grave and exhumed her body. They brought it to the lost cemetery. where they placed it on the pedestal as a sacrifice. As they waited for the witch to appear, they could feel a sense of dread washing over them. They didn't know if their sacrifice would be enough to break the curse, but as they waited, they could hear the sound of footsteps approaching. The witch had come. She approached the pedestal and looked at the body of the young girl. She could feel the girl's innocence and purity, and she knew that this was the sacrifice she had been waiting for. She touched the girl's body, and then she vanished into thin air. John and his friends could feel the curse lifting from them. They knew that they had broken the curse, and that they were finally free. They left the lost cemetery, feeling a sense of relief and happiness that they had never felt before. Years passed, and John and his friends moved on with their lives. They never forgot about the lost cemetery or the witch that had haunted them. They knew that they had been lucky to escape her curse, and they made sure to never disturb her rest again. They had learned their lesson, and they knew that some things were better left alone. Story 3. The Abandoned Hospital and the Ghost Doctor. In the heart of the city, there was an old hospital that had been abandoned for years. The building was large and imposing, with broken windows and creaking doors. It was said that strange things happened inside the hospital, that the spirits of the patients who had died there still roamed the halls. One night, a group of teenagers decided to explore the abandoned hospital. They had heard the rumors about the ghosts, but they didn't believe them. They thought it would be a fun adventure, a chance to explore a creepy old building and scare themselves silly. They entered the hospital through a broken window, using their flashlights to navigate the dark corridors. The air was musty and damp, and they could hear the sound of rats scurrying in the walls. The hospital was in a state of disrepair, with debris scattered everywhere and the smell of decay lingering in the air. As they made their way deeper into the hospital, they started to hear strange noises. They heard the sound of doors slamming shut and footsteps echoing in the hallways. They thought it was just their imagination playing tricks on them, so they continued on. But then they heard a sound that made their blood run cold. It was the sound of a child crying. They followed the sound, which led them to a room on the second floor. The door was slightly ajar, and they could see a faint light shining through the crack. They pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dark, with only a single candle flickering on a table in the center of the room. And there, in the corner, was a small child, sitting on the floor and crying. The teenagers were shocked. They had expected to find nothing but an empty room. They approached the child, trying to comfort her, but as they got closer, they could see that something was wrong. The child's eyes were hollow and lifeless, and her skin was pale and cold to the touch. Suddenly, the room grew cold. The candle flickered and went out, plunging them into total darkness. The sound of the child's crying turned into a scream, and the teenagers could feel something cold and damp touching their skin. They tried to run, but the door was stuck. They were trapped in the room with the ghostly child. They could hear her laughter echoing in the darkness, taunting them. They could feel her breath on their necks, and they knew that they were not alone. They tried to call for help, but their phones had no signal. They were trapped, with no way out. And then, they heard the sound of footsteps approaching. The footsteps grew louder and louder, until they were right outside the door. And then, the door slowly creaked open. The teenagers could see nothing but darkness beyond the door. And then, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was the ghost of a doctor, wearing a white lab coat and holding a surgical knife. He approached the teenagers, his eyes cold and dead, and then, he started to chase them. The teenagers ran through the hospital, trying to find a way out. but the doctor was always one step ahead of them. They could hear his laughter echoing through the halls, and they could feel his cold breath on their necks. Finally, they came to a dead end. The doctor was approaching, his knife gleaming in the dim light. The teenagers huddled together, waiting for the final blow. And then, the doctor vanished. The hospital was suddenly silent. The teenagers looked at each other in disbelief. They had escaped the ghostly doctor. They ran out of the hospital as fast as they could, not looking back. They knew that they had seen something that night, something that they could not explain, and they knew that they would never forget their experience in the abandoned hospital. After that night, the teenagers tried to put the experience behind them, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them out of the hospital, something that was watching them, waiting for its next opportunity. One by one, the teenagers started to experience strange occurrences. They would wake up in the middle of the night to find their room freezing cold, even though the thermostat was set to warm. They would hear the sound of footsteps echoing in their empty hallways, and the sound of doors slamming shut, and they would see shadows moving in the corners of their eyes, even when they were alone. They tried to ignore it, but the experiences only grew more frequent and more intense. They started to see the ghostly doctor in their dreams, his cold eyes staring back at them. They could feel his knife at their throats, ready to strike. Finally, they couldn't take it anymore. They went back to the abandoned hospital, hoping to find some answers, some way to put an end to their torment. The hospital was just as they remembered it, dark and foreboding. They entered cautiously, their flashlights illuminating the dark corridors. They didn't know what they were looking for, but they hoped to find some clue, some evidence that would explain what was happening to them. And then, they saw it, a room that they had never seen before, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the hospital. The door was slightly ajar, and they could see a faint light shining through the crack. They pushed the door open, their hearts pounding, and there, in the center of the room, was a small girl, sitting on the floor and crying. But this time, they knew better than to approach her. They could see the lifeless look in her eyes, and they knew that she was not a living child. And then, they heard the sound of footsteps approaching. They turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind them, trapping them in the room. The ghostly doctor appeared in the doorway, his knife gleaming in the dim light. He approached the teenagers, his eyes cold and dead. And then, he spoke. "I have been waiting for you," he said. "I have been waiting for you to return. You disturbed my rest, and now you must pay the price." The teenagers tried to run, but the doctor was too fast. He caught them one by one, his knife flashing in the dim light. And then, one by one, they fell. As the last teenager lay dying on the cold hospital floor, they knew that they had been foolish to come back to the abandoned hospital. They had disturbed something that they should have left alone. And as their eyes closed for the final time, they could hear the sound of the ghostly doctor's laughter echoing through the halls. The lost souls of the abandoned hospital had claimed their final victims, and their spirits would haunt the hospital forever. Years passed, and the abandoned hospital became a place of legend in the small town. People spoke of the ghostly doctor and the lost souls that haunted the halls. Some dared to enter the hospital, seeking thrills and adventure, but most stayed far away, fearing for their lives. But one day, a group of curious teenagers decided to explore the hospital. They had heard the stories, but they didn't believe them. They thought that they were just urban legends, meant to scare people away from the abandoned building. As they entered the hospital, they could feel a sense of foreboding. The air was thick with the memory of the past, and they could hear the sound of whispers and moans in the darkness. They walked cautiously through the halls, their flashlights illuminating the shadows. They saw signs of the hospital's former glory, but it was clear that the building had been abandoned for many years. As they reached the third floor, they heard the sound of footsteps approaching. They turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind them, trapping them in the hallway. And then, they saw it, the ghostly doctor, his eyes cold and dead, standing at the end of the hallway. His knife gleamed in the darkness, and his lips twisted into a sinister grin. The teenagers tried to run, but the doctor was too fast. He caught them one by one, his knife flashing in the dim light. And then, one by one, they fell. But there was one teenager who was different. She had always been sensitive to the paranormal, and she could sense the ghostly doctor's presence. She knew that she had to do something to stop him. She searched the hospital, looking for any clue that would help her defeat the ghostly doctor. And then, she found it, an old medical journal, filled with notes from the hospital's former doctors. As she read through the journal, she discovered that the ghostly doctor had been a cruel and sadistic physician. He had tortured his patients, experimenting on them without their consent. His spirit was trapped in the hospital, unable to move on until he had claimed enough victims to satisfy his bloodlust. The teenager knew what she had to do. She had to find a way to stop the doctor, to put his spirit to rest. She searched the hospital for the doctor's remains, hoping to find a way to destroy them. And finally, she found them, in a forgotten room, hidden away in the basement. She discovered a pile of bones, still wearing the doctor's old medical scrubs. She took the bones and burned them, watching as the flames consumed the remains. And as the bones turned to ash, the ghostly doctor's laughter echoed through the halls, his spirit finally put to rest. The hospital remained abandoned, but the stories of the ghostly doctor and the lost souls faded away, and the teenager who had put an end to the doctor's reign of terror went on to become a paranormal investigator, dedicating her life to helping others who were haunted by the supernatural.